Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I grew up in an ancient farmhouse someplace in Pennsylvania. It was an old building with a few fairly obvious additions here and there. The core of the building, a rather large central room with an impressive fireplace, was well over 200 years old. Other parts were significantly younger, and I can say that my parents did their part in adding to the renovations this home had. Sometimes, though, age has nothing to do with how scary a house can be to a young kid. The basement was relatively new. It had apparently been expanded in the mid-60s, with the owner at the time finishing a second room down there. The best way to describe it would be as a pair of parallel rectangles, touching along the longer edge and separated by a single door. The original, somewhat less finished room wasn't that bad. The stairs led down to it, and we had a freezer sitting at the bottom of the staircase. It's where we'd always put stuff like ice cream, so I learned to like the times when I'd go down to the basement and grab something from it. We also kept the model train set down there. My dad would tinker for hours on his track setup, getting it to look as nice as possible. He'd teach my brother and I how to make foam mountains, how to paint water, and a whole bunch of other tips I still use today when playing miniatures games. No, the second room was the bad room. It was all those mysterious pipes and fixtures that, as a kid, I assumed existed only to make weird noises and scare the shit out of me during late nights when I couldn't sleep. There was a big, heavy storm door that led off to it from the main room. I remember struggling to open it one time when I needed to grab the cross-country skis so that my dad and I could go out one winter day. The room had no windows and was illuminated by a few poorly installed fluorescent lights that would always flicker. It's also where the cages were. You see, when my family bought the house, my parents were excited at getting such a great deal on it. Then, halfway through buying it, my parents came back from one of the interminable real estate talks looking annoyed and arguing. My mother still liked the house, but my dad had found something out that he didn't like. Years later, I learned the real reason it was so cheap. The guy selling it had been convicted of animal abuse and was selling the house to pay off his legal fees. I didn't know that when I was young, but I did know about the cages. There were 6 of them, and until I was in 4th grade, we used them for storage. In that dark, windowless room, there were 6 cages all along one wall. The first 2 were normal enough. The concrete was a bit stained, but not horribly so. The next 2 had pretty bad stains on the floor, stains that wouldn't come out no matter how many cleaning products we used on them. The last 2 were the worst. The wire had been ripped open from the inside, chewed open by a pair of half-starved boars looking to get out of that hellhole. Imagine that. No light, locked in a cage, starving, and so desperate to escape that you'd chew through wire and drag yourself through a tiny hole, one that left scratches across your entire body. I don't even want to talk about the stains on the floor there. My parents eventually painted the floors gray to match the rest of the room, just to cover them up. This room was scary. It was also next to the train, so my brother and I never went down to play with them on those dark, scary nights where you just spend the whole time feeling nervous and freaking out. Don't go into the basement on bad nights, don't open the door to the cage room, don't play with the trains if you're home alone. It started as a childish superstition, but it grew into a habit as we both got older. We got a dog, a friendly Labrador retriever who loved everyone and would always climb on the couch if he thought he could get away with it. He was a great dog. Hell, he helped me get over my crippling fear of dogs, if that tells you anything. One night my brother and I were home alone, the parents having gone out for the evening or something. We honestly didn't mind. We had the TV for entertainment, and it's not like we were so young that we couldn't be left alone. After a healthy dinner of pizza, successfully ordered by my older brother, who was in 7th grade at the time, we were both chilling in the living room, watching cartoons like all well-adjusted middle schoolers. It was a shitty night out, the wind and rain battering the big glass doors in the living room, and occasional flashes of lightning lighting up the sky. Being the mature guys that we were, we sure as hell weren't scared and even headed out for a short walk with the dog before settling in for the night. It really was bad out. You know how the sky sometimes turns weird colors during bad storms? Well, it was a weirdly dark reddish-purple color. I'm not sure what to call it, but all I know is it was the kind of sky that made you want to stay inside. Late in the evening, lightning struck something and a fuse blew in the house. As sitting around without power wasn't that appealing to either one of us, we needed to head down to the basement and hit the fuse box. It was right at the bottom of the stairs, something that wouldn't have troubled either of us on any other night. But let's face it, when you're a kid and it's a terrifying night out, you don't want to go any place scarier than a well-lit room. We grabbed flashlights and headed to the stairs, bringing the dog with us for comfort. He was relaxed and acting like his usual self, maybe a little more self-satisfied than usual because my brother had him on the couch. He came down with us, shoring up our resolve as we hit the fuse. Relief. The lights switched back on just fine. We both started to head back up the stairs, but the dog wasn't coming. Instead, he was staring at the door to the cage room. His hair was standing on edge, and it looked like he was ready to jump on something. My brother, thinking the dog was just being slow, grabbed for him, but the dog just ran closer to the door, hair still raised, and started growling. A low, menacing sound coming from the gentlest dog I'd ever met. The lights chose that moment to shut off. I panicked for a second, but then realized that it must have been another lightning strike. I didn't hear any thunder, which was weird, but whatever. It was pitch black in that basement. No light, and my flashlight wasn't too effective. My brother was standing next to me and started to say something, probably a joke about how I was so scared. Suddenly there was a little noise, kind of like something was scratching at the heavy door to the cage room. I thought it was nothing at first until I heard the first thump. It started off fairly light, but then got louder and louder. Thump, thump, thump. The door was practically rattling. It sounded like something big was throwing itself at the door again and again. Our dog started barking, not the normal kind of bark you get from a lab, sort of friendly and interested, but that deep-throated, fear-triggering bark that dogs sometimes give when something is legitimately wrong. The door was shaking even harder now, the rattling a terrible counterpoint to our dog's frenzied barking. Suddenly, I heard the sound of that heavy door bursting open, slamming against the wall and sending out a loud crashing noise. My brother bolted upstairs, knocking me over and making me freak out. I saw something in that pitch-black darkness, something that looked like a pair of glowing eyes. Our dog stopped barking and began to growl, a low, menacing sound that put me on edge even more. The glowing red eyes started moving towards me. I was paralyzed with fear. It was like looking into the worst moment of your life over and over again. I knew our dog would protect me, would keep whatever that thing was from hurting me. Or at least I hoped. The lights snapped back on. I was sitting on the floor, scared out of my mind. Our dog stopped growling and wandered over to me, giving me a quick lick, and then padded up the stairs, apparently satisfied with his work for the evening. The storm door was closed and locked. Ever since then, on dark nights like that, our dog would get paranoid. He'd wander around, barking at certain doors in the house, especially the basement door, but sometimes at the back door. Occasionally, I'd see flashes of motion like something was trying to get in. He did this even after we tore out those cages, even after we moved to a different house. I'm not a superstitious guy, but whenever the weather ends up like that night, I get scared. I lock the doors, leave a light on in the house, and make sure I've got someone with me. Our dog died not too long ago. He was great up until the end, and remained the friendliest animal I've ever met. I don't know what I'm going to do now that he's gone and can't watch out for me anymore. I've got a few more creepy stories from that house. Not sure if people want to hear them because they're somewhat long-winded, but I lived in a creepy goddamn house as a child, and weird stuff like this is exactly the reason I still have trouble sleeping. A little more history on this old house might help. It was supposedly part of the Underground Railroad, although we could never get any proper historical confirmation for that. Might have just been a random thing someone tried to tack onto it. All I knew was that it was an incredibly old house, and it was horrifyingly creepy to live in, especially late at night. Now, a lot of the stuff that scared me when I was a kid was related to my parents' work. They both had to leave and come back at odd hours in the day, and on occasions I wouldn't see one of them for a couple days, thanks to the insane hours. I'm sure some people can guess a career based off of that, but I'll just say that hearing the front door creak open when you're a young kid with sleeping problems, recurring nightmares, and oddly good hearing is not good for your mental health. I've got a few stories that might be interesting, depending on what people want to hear about. That previous one was prepped, working on it as an art project with someone, and while I can't give scans due to her perfectionist nature regarding the art, I have a few other stories that I can tell. So let me know what you want to hear based on the little mental titles I've thought up. The Voices in the Barn, the Shady Grove, Tales of the Attic, the Picture Window, the Nightmare Room, the Fireplace. Alright, Nightmare Room it is. This is actually a story I tend to tell when my brother and I are reminiscing about this old house. We lived there for a decent amount of time, all things considered, and since we were young, a lot of lore sprung up between us. A lot of close friends from when we lived there also know it, mostly because our first encounter with it was during a sleepover. My brother's room was in the attic. The staircase was a narrow, wooden, and goddamn precarious to a kid wearing socks, so running up it was a bad idea. I can't count the number of times I managed to injure myself on that stupid stairwell, but that's not the point. You see, the attic was divided in two parts. My brother's room, which was a decently large finished space up there, and the honeycomb of storage rooms built around the 1940s. The storage rooms were through a door immediately to the right of the staircase, and seeing as it used one of those old school latches, it tended to creak open randomly. Go through the door and there were 3 or 4 tiny rooms, most of which were filled with junk. Honestly, it's kinda hard to describe. The door opened up into a little corridor which branched off into 2 rooms. See what I mean about the honeycomb? That people could easily get to. It was hot, dark, and creepy in there, and so we tried to keep the door latched at all times, even putting tape on the door to keep it shut. Well, one night during a sleepover, things hit the usual young kids doing truth or dare bullshit that you end up doing. My brother, being an asshole, dared me to explore the storage rooms, which had a bunch of shit left over from the last guy, with only a flashlight. I agreed, despite being a huge coward, and grabbed the shitty flashlight he kept in his room. Now I assumed that there were only 2 rooms in there, filled with junk. When I was looking around in the dark, I found a door that had been painted over in one of them. There was no handle, so I couldn't get it open, but I knew it had to be interesting, so after completing the room, we all decided to take a look. My brother grabbed a screwdriver, and after working for a few minutes, he managed to get the door to swing open. The room was barely the size of a closet, and looked like it was meant to hold a fuse box or something. We were nonplussed, so after some righteous video gaming, we all ended up going to sleep, leaving the door to that hidden room open. None of us got any sleep. Nightmare after nightmare after nightmare all night long. I can't remember them. Hell, it's been years. But that night still sucked. Everyone kept waking up, and my brother, pissed at how he kept waking up, blamed me for finding the nightmare room. The name stuck. We decided that something had to be up with it when my brother barely slept that entire week. It was worse than when he saw The Exorcist and freaked out, and I got used to chatting with him at 2 in the morning, watching public access and just avoiding sleep. Finally, he quietly told me that he thought it was the room. All the dreams involved something coming out of there, a thing made of darkness that just wanted to smother the life out of him. I was no stranger to recurring nightmares, so I knew how shitty it was to have that happening. So one day, we went and tried to seal the door again. No matter what we tried, it would always swing open after a couple of days. We tried everything, painting over it again, wedging boxes in front of the door, even nailing it once, and getting yelled at by our parents for unsupervised use of a hammer and nails. Every goddamn time it would come open. The time we nailed it shut, we must have used shitty nails or something, because when we looked at the door when his nightmares started again, they were just sticking in the door, as though we'd held it open and hammered them through rather than actually nailing it to the frame. I still don't know what the hell was up with that room. We moved out about a month after the time we nailed it shut. My brother tried to convince me to actually stay in there for a night, but there was no way I would stand in a pitch-black closet for an entire night, waiting for something to happen. I realize I was a bit unclear on the timeline with this one. The door was first opened about 5 months before we moved. It would swing open if my brother didn't explicitly check on it, usually by wedging a box, and the incidents grew more scattered as we tried closing it again. I know, kind of a lame story with an epic title, but that room scared the living shit out of both of us for a long time afterwards. It's more of a personal horror. That door kept opening, even though we did everything we could to make sure it stayed shut, and I have no idea how it managed to stay shut when it was just painted over. Any other stories people want to hear? I promise some of them are considerably less lame than this one.
Just dump them all. But if you want a suggestion, I don't know. The Shady Grove sounds like /X/ material right off the bat.
Good. That one's legitimately screwed up. Now, as I mentioned, this place was an old farmhouse and so stood on a huge property. We'd fenced in about an acre so that the dog could run around without us having to watch him, which was a huge summer project when we first moved in when I was maybe 7, I think. Fun project, all things considered. even though my contribution was nailing up some of the wire netting after my dad drove in the fence posts. It was good family bonding time. Outside of the fence was one of those forests that were typical of Pennsylvania, bordering on what I'm pretty sure was a swamp. There were a lot of cool places back there, and I would explore back there with friends, building forts and shit in the woods, kid stuff. About a mile back, somewhat off of the property, was a little clearing in the swampy forest, near a creek. I first found it while dicking around in the woods, looking for interesting stuff to build yet another random fort back there with a friend. There was a little grove of sick-looking trees, with an old, rusted lawnmower sitting under them. The first thing about that grove is that it was dead silent, except for the sounds of the creek nearby. It's kind of hard to explain the feeling there, but you know when it's about to storm and you feel a whole bunch of pressure. It was always like that, and weirdly dark, despite the fact there shouldn't be enough trees to make it that dark. The dog hated going out that far, and he especially hated that grove of trees. He would always get pissed off and try to run away when we went to that area, so it wasn't exactly a frequent stop-off. One night, a friend and I decided to go camping on the property. I wanted to put the tent near to the house, but he really wanted to head out pretty far in the woods, and so we schlepped everything out there, along with my brother and a couple of his friends. After wandering around, we ended up near that grove. It was the driest piece of ground around and seemed decently sheltered from the rain. After we managed to get a fire started and night started falling, we were definitely feeling a little creeped out. That heavy feeling wasn't going away, and the grove was beginning to creep me out. I kept seeing motion at the edge of my vision, all coming from the grove. Still, it was dark, and it would take forever to head home if we wanted to change where we were camping. Not to mention it was darker than it should be. Seriously, it was practically pitch black in that clearing, despite the fact it was a fairly nice night out. I decided to take a leak and stupidly went to that grove of trees for privacy. As I walked towards the trees, I immediately felt really goddamn uneasy. This was quickly changing from fun to what the hell are we doing out here, and I did not like it. As I was taking a piss, I started hearing something. It was like a weird whispering coming from further on in the woods right past the weird grove. Now I'm never going to forget that whispering. It was creepy as shit, sounding like come closer, whispered over and over again by something. I had no idea if it was real, but I was freaked out, and so hustled back to the camp. The other guys were still cooking, and as we settled down, my friend went over to the grove to follow my example. After a minute, he came booking it back, yelling at us to cut it out and stop messing with him. As he staggered back to the little circle of light, he asked which one of us was hiding in the woods and making noise to mess with him. All of us were at the fire. As he calmed down, he told me that whichever one of us was hiding back there, telling him to come closer, was going to get their ass kicked. I was suitably freaked out, and so opted to finish dinner and get in the goddamn tent, for what little protection it would provide. That night was one of the shittiest ones of my life. We kept hearing whispering coming from outside the tent. Come closer was frequently repeated, and it was not helping the weird silence that was around the grove. My friend, who was considerably more level-headed, insisted that it was just the wind, and so we settled in, trying to ignore it. As it got later, the whispering got louder, and more sounds started filling the night. For a little while, it sounded like somebody was crashing around in the woods a little ways off, and we'd hear weird snapping noises, like somebody was breaking branches that sounded like they were right on top of the tent. Every time we checked, there was nothing out there. Believe me, all of us were checking, and I doubt we were all screwing with each other. Around midnight, I was at my wit's end and needed to go take a fear piss. Mustering up my courage, I went out of the tent and promptly decided that it was a bad idea. Standing in the copse was a vaguely human figure. I couldn't make out any details other than the fact it had no hair and was smiling way too widely to be human. It looked right at me and smiled widely, beckoning me closer. I promptly screamed like a banshee and ran back to the safety of the tents. Everyone else stormed out and asked what the hell was wrong with me. As I stuttered and tried to explain what was going on, they looked at me like I was crazy as I tried to explain that I'd seen something. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night because things were insanely tense. Everyone was jumping at little sounds, and there was some shit that no one could explain. Like how someone inside the tents would swear that there was a raging windstorm going outside, but no one else would hear anything. We headed home the second it got light out, and I tried to never go back to that area of the woods. My friend still jokes about that creepy place in the woods, and I never quite figured out what the hell was going on out there. It was still creepy, and I got dragged there by my friend on occasion. Tried doing the Ouija board thing out there once, which is where another story picks up. I'll start typing that one up in a couple of minutes. I really should have written these out beforehand. Next story, the picture window. The picture. Okay, maybe a bit sporadic with this one. Trying to type it up as fast as possible, but I've got dinner on the stove, and I'd like to avoid messing it up too badly. So it was a wonderful time. I'd just gotten into high school and started showing an interest in females. Parents were gone for the weekend, and through the use of careful disinformation and knowing a guy with a car, I had a few friends over, including a chick I was courting at the time. Being stupid high schoolers, we somehow got on the topic of creepy stuff that has happened in life, and thus over to ghost stories. Probably said something about my taste in women at that age, because goth chicks were interesting, but it was the best a nerd like me could do, and she was decently cute. I told a few of the stories of the old house, and she decided that trying to hold a seance out in the woods would be a great idea. Now, being a hormone-addled adolescent, I saw this as a chance to make out in the dark woods when she inevitably freaked out, and overrode my usual insane fear of that particular area. We trooped out, Ouija board in hand. Aside from myself and Spooky, there was my friend, who was there for the Shady Grove campout, and his girlfriend. We went into the woods and found the spot again. Both of the guys remained freaked out when we got back there. It was a creepy as hell experience, and I sure as hell didn't want to repeat. The only change after all those years was that the lawnmower had rusted out even more, and there were some random bones scattered around. Animal, but still creepy. Laughing at our obvious discomfort, we were teased by the ladies and soon sat down to play with the Ouija board. We lit a bunch of candles and set them around the board, with the girls giggling at how we were freaking out. The oddly heavy sensation was still there, and while I couldn't hear any whispering, I assumed it would be back. So we all sat down and started playing around. Nothing too interesting, mostly steering the pointer to say stupid stuff, but pretty soon, we started actually getting freaked out. Finally, Spooky and my friend's girlfriend were the only ones at the board, while my friend and I watched, trying to control our fear. They asked some stupid question about where to go in life or something like that, and then put their hands on the pointer or whatever it's called. It slowly spelled out, "Come closer," which immediately had my friend and I freaked out. You see, that's part of the story we hadn't mentioned. We just said that there was messed up whispering during the night. They giggled at the weird non-answer while we told them that we had to leave now. All the candles blew out at once and things felt horrible. I grabbed Spooky, my friend grabbed his girlfriend, and we booked it through the woods, tripping a lot. When we made it back to the house, the girls were pissed off at how we'd freaked. Finally, we told them the whole story and they started freaking out and demanding to go home. Being obliging, my friend did so, and our chances were clearly ruined with them, and he opted to spend the night drowning our sorrows in video games and the occasional pinched beer. Now, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but the game console was in the attic in my brother's room. We had an old TV up there hooked up to an N64 and decided to play some damn GoldenEye to try and keep from going nuts. He was out doing whatever it was he did back then, so we had the attic to ourselves. Near the TV, however, was a gigantic window facing out over the yard. I hated the damn thing, especially on nights with a really bright moon. There were always weird shapes moving across the lawn at night, probably deer, but sometimes I just didn't want to know, and tried to avoid being up there late at night. I still don't know how he slept up there all the time, but that's how life goes, I suppose. While we were sitting up there complaining about life in general, there was a gigantic thump against the picture window. We both jumped and looked to see what the hell was going on. There was nothing out there. No trees to hit the window, no stunned birds on the ground, nothing. It was eerie how still the yard was. We were both getting a little freaked out, but we settled back into gaming. About 10 minutes later, there was another loud thump coming from the window. Both of us looked out and saw a figure standing in the yard. Same one from the Grove. I'll never forget that creepy thing. It looked right up at us and smiled. Then there was another gigantic crash and a bunch of cracks appeared in the window, like something had been thrown at it. We both freaked out and ran downstairs, turning on every light that we could and holding up until morning. It was creepy as shit, and we didn't imagine the cracks. My brother was goddamn pissed at us for cracking the windows when he got back the next day, and refused to believe that we hadn't done anything. That window always freaked me out, though. I'd see weird shapes and shadows flitting across it during those late nights I spent hanging out with my brother, watching Midnight Run and bullshitting. I know things are a bit fractured at this point, but I really can't say much more than vague, creepy things without making up a bunch of things. Those events of seeing weird things out of it happened enough that they just didn't really stick. It's only when things got threatening, like that night, that I really had them stick in my mind. All right, I have food. Let me know what people want to hear next. I'll post up a rough chronology at some point so people can know vaguely when things occurred. Drawing up the floor plan of the place, color-coded by the rough date of the additions and such. I'll start with the basement and then go on to do the rest of it. Might make the stories a little easier to understand. Scale is going to be off, so don't take it too seriously. It's just the rough layout. Sorry for the delay, Kat decided to puke, so I decided to get some cleaning done before continuing. Much as I love writing this stuff out, real-life concerns are important. So, the fireplace. This happened right around when my family first moved into the house. I was very young at the time, and seeing as we'd just moved out of a house where I shared a room with my older brother, I was glad to be able to choose a room for myself in this seemingly gigantic house. I got to take a room on the second floor. The layout was a bit odd. It was a divided room with a fireplace occupying one wall. My parents warned me that I shouldn't try lighting any fires in it. Apparently, it was one of the older rooms and the chimney had been knocked out to make room for an addition. It was a creepy fireplace. It was made entirely of cast iron and always seemed to have a bit of ash in it, despite the lack of anything being burned in it. The flue still worked, but it was totally bricked up after about a foot. I didn't like that fireplace, but no matter where I put my bed, I'd have to look at it while I was sleeping. Picture explanation: gray boxes are the dog cages, green are the stairs. This is the basement layout. After about a month, I started having nightmares involving the fireplace. I was scared to sleep alone in my room because in the right light, the whole thing seemed to change into a gaping mouth. I remember having the same dream over and over. The fireplace, covered in white and steaming slightly, would draw me closer and closer, until I ended up inside of it and it slowly crushed me to death. Believe me, this kind of thing was pretty horrible for a kid that young to experience night after night. I was a wreck, but my parents didn't really think too much of it. Finally, one winter day, I woke up and looked over at the fireplace. It looked exactly the same as it had in my dream, and I freaked the hell out. My dad explained it to me. Apparently, if you leave the flue open, an old fireplace like this would get covered in frost during the night, and I shouldn't worry about it. The only problem with his explanation is that A, the flue was closed, and B, this fireplace didn't even connect to the outside. Despite how warm the house was, the frost stayed on that all day, until it was time to go to sleep. I refused to sleep in my room that night, eventually falling asleep in the living room. Layout of the first floor: red bordered room is the original farmhouse, the rest are additions added later. Yellow is the doors to the outside, green is the staircase up, gray is the staircase leading down to the basement. I woke up that night standing in front of the fireplace in my room. I've never had a history of sleepwalking. Never. It was one of the scariest moments in my life, if only because it corresponded with my dreams. I started screaming my head off and my parents rushed in, confused to see me standing in front of the frost-covered fireplace. The room was maybe 10 degrees colder than the rest of the house, and everyone in my family was suitably freaked out. This pattern continued for about a week. I would refuse to sleep in my room and wake up standing in front of the frost-covered fireplace. My family assumed I was just acting out because I thought my brother had the better room, but I knew it was because of that goddamn fireplace, and I was adamant. Finally, my dad, annoyed by what he believed to be heat loss, had an inspector in. He couldn't explain why the room was colder. Apparently, there were no obvious leaks in there, and the fireplace was behind perfectly fine insulation. We bricked up the fireplace about a month later. It still freaked me out, but that goddamn mouth couldn't get me anymore. It seemed to solve the heating problem at the very least, and I never had any problems with sleepwalking again. Second floor layout: green bordered rooms are bathrooms, red is the fireplace. Other meanings are the same as other little maps. Sorry for the shitty scale, and I can explain any of the weird stuff if necessary. Alright, back from errands and enjoying the wonders of sitting on a couch watching Equilibrium with some company. So I'm going to keep this a little short because I've got more interesting stuff to do than write about my goofy past on 4chan. Gasp. The barn was nothing more than a weird ruin, half collapsed. It was half on our property near the border of what we owned and the forest. Not sure why exactly, but I knew it acted as a marker for where my brother and I could go unsupervised for a while. There was nothing especially creepy about it when I first went there with my brother, exploring the property not long after we'd arrived. The creepiness started later, when we were out searching for the dog on one of the nights he hopped the fence and started enjoying the hell out of running around. We were out near sunset, and ended up near the barn in our random searching. It still looked pretty shitty, all things considered, but something about the half-light of the time made it look a bit foreboding. My brother thought the dog might have gotten in there, so we had to look around inside the stone base of it. As we were exploring, I heard something that sounded like a muffled voice coming from one corner of the barn. Having been scared to death by random voices that I heard while in these woods before, I chickened out immediately, but my brother went. The moment he set foot in the corner, we both heard a man's voice yell, "Look out!" My brother jumped when he heard it and then disappeared. Map of the attic. Red bordered room is the nightmare room, yellow is the picture window, and gray is the stairs downstairs. I'll toss up a picture of the whole property with my last post. Now at this point I was freaked out. My brother had just disappeared and some dude was yelling at us. I looked around frantically trying to figure out where that guy was, but I didn't see anyone. Then I heard shouting. My brother was still alive but injured. He'd fallen into an old storage room under the barn and thought his leg might be broken. He was freaking out and told me to go get help. Now, while I was gone, he said he heard someone talking to him. I don't know if it's true or not because he's my brother and loves tricking me like that, but he said a man told him that he'd screwed up and needed to get out of there. He couldn't see the guy, but carried on a short conversation. The man's voice got increasingly more threatening, but my brother never saw him. By the time I got back, he was scared witless, and when we fished him out, he wouldn't stop telling us to find the guy who was threatening him. There was no one around, and we didn't see anyone near the barn, even though he was apparently talking to my brother until the moment I got there with my dad. Now, my brother isn't someone to let something like this die. After we figured out that he'd just sprained his ankle in the fall, he wanted to go back and find that man. It was dark out, so we decided to do it the next day, simply because it would be dangerous to explore a hole-filled barn without good light. The dog stopped back home, soaking wet and happy from some random creek, and I thought things were done for this particular adventure. That is, until my brother dragged me out there with him the next day, limping along and carrying some flashlights. We got back to the barn and looked at the area where he'd fallen in. It was some sort of old root cellar or something. We carefully climbed in, making sure that we could get out, and took a look around. It was small, damp, and full of random shit. It was a wonder that my brother hadn't died by falling on the big pile of rusty metal not 3 feet from where he had landed. The oddest things we found were a large rusty hook suspended from one of the rafters, with a man's coat hanging from it. It was unbelievably creepy. We eventually found the way up, a trapdoor in the ceiling, and got the hell out of there. Ever so often we'd hear odd voices near the barn. Usually it was a couple people arguing, although the voice that my brother heard apparently recurred several times. We finally tore the thing down and filled in the cellar when we were selling the property, which means that barn no longer stands. It was a creepy fucking thing, to say the least. Alright, final story for me. The attic, as previously mentioned, was a creepy place at times. My brother's room was there after he managed to finish the entire room, with the help of my dad. It involved a lot of work getting the entire room sanded, stained, and otherwise made more livable than it once was. During this process, it was common that we'd hear weird noises coming from the attic. As I mentioned previously, the staircase leading up to it was narrow, slippery, and hard to climb at times. So if you heard something while working up there, you'd better hope that it's only your imagination. I've talked about the windows, the storage rooms, and that odd hidden room in the back that never seemed to close. I may as well talk a bit about the finishing process and the weird stuff that happened up there. First off, tools would randomly move while we were out of the room. This wasn't minor stuff like a few screws disappearing either. Stuff like an entire cordless drill would be gone for days, only to reappear in the same spot we'd left it.
Where was this house?
Pennsylvania. I haven't lived there for about 12 years, so I have no idea if it's even still around. Other oddities of the attic involved strange lights coming from up there before we had it finished. Occasionally, we'd see flashes of light up there while walking the dog out in the yard. The thing that stopped me from working up there for about a week was when I was home alone and had to walk the dog for the afternoon. As I was traversing the yard, making sure he didn't bolt like usual, I happened to look up and see into the big picture window. There was a man standing there. I can't describe his features or any shit like that. It was just a guy wearing a coat and a hat staring out at me. He didn't acknowledge that I existed, just stared out of the house looking around. I rushed inside and looked in the attic. The door was closed and locked when I got there. Bear in mind it locks from the outside at this point, so there's no way anyone could have gotten into the house. Remember the layout. It took me all of 10 seconds to get inside, run upstairs, and check on the door. I unlocked it and looked around for a while. There was no one up there, and nothing in front of the window that could have possibly made that silhouette. It was jarring, to say the least, and I spent the next few days convinced there was a ghost up there, which explained the odd noises and flashes of light to my young mind. That attic was creepy, and I'd like to think that most of my brother's odd attributes come from living there for a long, long time. I hope you all enjoyed these stories. Here's a vague map of the property, drawn with the major features picked out. I know it's crude, but here's the breakdown. Black house garage, black box fenced-in area, light green box property, red dot the old barn, light green squiggles foresty regions, dark green squiggles swampy regions, blue creek, red star the shady glen, gray road. The big window in the attic faced towards the back of the property, indicated with a yellow dot on the building. So these are my stories. Thanks for listening to me, and I hope you all enjoyed this thread full of odd stories from my childhood. It does me good to know that people still love old, creepy houses and the weird stories associated with them.
You never answered the other Anon's question about where exactly it is. I would love to check out that forest too.
Somewhere in the Lehigh Valley. I'm checking with my family to see if the property still exists. Remember, it's been years. Also remember that a lot of this is private property. The only open area is the Shady Glen, and I'm attempting to see if everything still exists.
Well, even if it is private property, the general area should still be the same. I doubt the new owners would even notice if people were camping there if, like you said, it was far from the house. I really doubt I would head out there anyway. I'm in Arizona, so even if I wanted to go, getting there would be a problem. I no longer have any friends in the Philly area now that the one friend I had there moved to California.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.